Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. US President Donald Trump and his top advisor Elon Musk held the newly administered cabinet's first meeting, outlining key priorities for his new administration. As part of this meeting, Trump confirmed that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will visit the White House to sign a minerals deal between the US and Ukraine. Zelensky has called the deal preliminary and pushed for US security guarantees to deter Russian aggression. Also, Canadian officials have expressed deep concerns over the long-term economic impact of Trump's tariffs. Meanwhile, Mexico is engaging in urgent diplomatic negotiations to prevent the tariffs from taking effect. Joining us to discuss everything US politics, we're first joined by Daniel Wagner, who is the CEO of Country Risk Solutions, who's joining us from Portland, USA. We're also joined by Ross Feingold, a political risk analyst, joining us from Taipei, Taiwan. And finally, we're joined by Dr. Jayjat Bhattacharya, who is the president of the CDEPR, who's joining us from New Delhi. I will start with you, if possible, Daniel. I really want to look at this meeting first, and then we can move on to the repercussions. But the meeting was, of course, there, and it pretty much took a question and answer format. But somebody who was key, who is not part of the cabinet, is Elon Musk. What message does it send to Trump's enemies and those who don't support him, and specifically also relating to Elon Musk, that he was there part of those first talks?
Well, on one hand, we would attribute great significance to it, but it's not like, no non-cabinet members have ever participated in a cabinet meeting in America. That happens quite frequently. In the context of the current discussions, the current events going on in America, it's pretty evident where the power lies. And the tension between the various cabinet members and Elon Musk was so thick you could probably cut it with a knife the other day. There's plenty of disagreement with what Trump is doing and with what Elon Musk are doing in America, but there's also plenty of dissent, it would appear, between the cabinet members on the direction that various programs are going and the exercise of power that Elon Musk is trying to exert on other cabinet members and their departments. The very idea that he would suggest that anyone who doesn't report their top 5 contributions to humanity last week, or the federal government at least, by a certain deadline would be fired, and then having various cabinet officials say to their employees, ignore that. I think that speaks volumes to the nature of the problem. Elon Musk is hugely controversial in America, and it's not just in party lines. There are plenty of people who purchase Tesla products who are now having buyer's remorse, and the sales of Tesla around the world are a testament to exactly how controversial and oppositional he is among many people around the world.
Absolutely, and Ross Feingold, of course, Elon Musk, they're defending his efforts, but they are being felt across the federal government departments. Musk, of course, is looking to continue his work with US aid specifically, and the political ramifications and geopolitical ramifications that could have are massive. But do you think this show of unity is a real sort of show of strength between Elon Musk and Donald Trump? And is it them showing the world that they are going to do what they are doing and nobody's going to get in the way?
I think that's fair to say. This is still the first few weeks of the Trump administration. In some ways, it's still a honeymoon period. In some ways, the team, including the cabinet secretaries, are still getting to know each other and they're still trying to understand just how much authority Elon Musk has. But it's certainly clear that President Trump, during this initial period of his second presidency, he does want to cut the size of the federal government, and he's entrusted Elon Musk to do that. And Musk is moving extraordinarily fast, so fast that that Musk and his team have clearly made some mistakes, which, to be fair to Musk, he did own up to in the cabinet meeting. He did say we're going to make mistakes, and when we do, we'll try to fix them. But I think we have to keep in mind that just like any new U.S. president, President Trump has what we call in the United States political capital, and he's going to use it. He's not going to have a second term. So now's the time to use the political capital that he won by being elected, and also with the Republicans taking control of both the Senate and the House. Now is the time to use that political capital. He doesn't have to worry about a next election. I mean, he sort of has to worry about the midterms in November 2026, but that's still very far away. So he's going to use that political capital to achieve his political goals. And we're seeing that every day of the recent 4 weeks.
Absolutely, Dr. Bhattacharya. Another topic that was discussed is, of course, this mineral deal that is set to be signed by Volodymyr Zelensky in the coming days, if not the coming hours by the time this is aired. But looking specifically now at what Trump is gaining out of this, he, of course, is looking for almost payment for the billions of dollars that were given to Ukraine as aid. Do you think that this message from him that he's going to get this money back and not guarantee any security shows that he's really looking to put America first and also potentially disregard relations that he has with other countries that are allies?
Yeah, so even though the real contours of the deal is not out there in public, but clearly the fact that the US is getting into such a deal sends a lot of signals. And the first signal, obviously, is it's still America first. Nothing has changed in that. And therefore, it doesn't matter if there's allies or there are adversaries on the other side, as long as it helps America in the short term. And if the transaction is beneficial for America, that's what the Trump administration will get into. And therefore, clearly, getting 50% of a $500 billion critical mineral and other mineral resources and access to it is a very sweet deal, and it does pay for much more than what the US has put into Ukraine for defending it. I think the real question is, what does Ukraine get out of it? Is it becoming a colony of US? Because if it signs off all its minerals, then that's what Ukraine becomes. It becomes a colony of US, or is it kind of the last stand of Ukraine in somehow ensuring that they get the security blanket of US. Now, even if the security clause is not there, which is what some of the indications are, and which is why Zelensky had trashed it in the beginning, that this is not a deal that Ukraine can get into because it doesn't really give much back to Ukraine. So it can't be a deal where the US says, I've paid you so much for your past security requirements, and therefore you need to pay it back with your critical minerals. Without a security guarantee for the future, that doesn't really work. Now, NATO was a security guarantee if it was happening, but President Trump has made it clear that Ukraine will not be part of NATO, which is also one of the asks that Russia had. So without these guarantees, this deal becomes a pointless deal for Zelensky, because if the Ukrainians are not in charge of their country, and if somebody else is in charge of the country, and US still gets 50% of the minerals, how does it help the Ukrainians? And therefore, possibly what is going to come out of this deal is that just the fact that US is having interest in those minerals will ensure that there is protection, will ensure that Russia will not invade the rest of Ukraine, and possibly that's what the deal will eventually be. Now, we should also keep in mind that Russia has also made a similar offer where the Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory also has critical minerals and other kinds of minerals, and Russia has offered a similar deal to the US Trump administration. So it'll be interesting to see how these deals pan out and what do each parties get out of these deals.
Absolutely. Ross Feingold, I'd like to come to you next. We've spoken a lot on this programme about, of course, the US influence in the China-Taiwan situation, given the fact that you are in Taipei. But looking overall at Donald Trump's foreign policy, of course, he's met with Macron. He's meeting with Starmer shortly. We know that US delegates have been meeting with Russian delegates in Istanbul. So what do you think his goal is for foreign policy moving forward, and how might that impact not just geopolitical relations, but also life inside of the US?
At least up to now, the foreign policy issue that most interests President Trump is clearly trade-related issues, and to him, that's the most important aspect of U.S. foreign relations with a number of other countries, and specifically the trade imbalance that the United States has with a number of countries, which are often countries that the United States has security alliances with. Some of the European countries come to mind: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. The U.S. doesn't have a security alliance with Taiwan, but it does have a friendly security relationship, and Taiwan has a huge trade surplus with the United States. So President Trump, when he's looking at other countries, he's looking at dollars and cents most of all, and he's looking at the trade imbalance. However, we really should keep in mind that other aspects of foreign relations, whether that's democracy, human rights, religious freedom, members of his team are genuinely interested in these issues. And we've seen some movement specifically with regard to China in recent days by the administration. And when they're described as China hawks, that's really what they are. And they're taking actions to show that on these other issues beyond trade, that they're going to continue a lot of the policies that we saw in the first Trump administration, and some of which carried over the Biden administration, such as technology export restrictions. Now we're going to have outbound investment restrictions where they're going to limit what kind of investments U.S. companies can make in China. We'll probably see another round of pressure on Chinese scholars working at institutions and doing research at institutions in the United States. So we're probably going to have that whole of government approach with China and possibly with other countries as well. We've seen some actions with regard to Venezuela in recent days as well. So when it comes to these other non-trade issues, I think the team is still going to be very hawkish on China as well as on other places around the world, such as Venezuela and Iran.
Absolutely. Daniel Wagner, I'd like to bring it back to trade and back to tariffs, something that we've been talking about for weeks, if not months at this point, something that Trump, of course, threatened during the lead up to his inauguration. But potential tariffs on the EU. I want to explore and get your opinion on what the impact of this might be, considering that the allegiances that were there during previous administrations between the US and its transatlantic allies, they were there, of course, but there have been disagreements. Do you think this 25% tariff, which might be imposed and has been proposed by Trump's administration, will have much of an effect to those relations, given what we've seen in regards to communication over Ukraine?
Well, the very threat of it has already had an impact on bilateral relations and relations between the EU and the US. The Europeans rightly don't take kindly to being coerced, and that's ultimately what this is. Now, there is, of course, a trade imbalance between the US and the EU, and that should be corrected. And it is, in fact, true that the Europeans don't tend to necessarily counter-correct on their own. They need a little incentive. And this was certainly proven when Trump wanted the Europeans to increase their allocations from their budget for defense from whatever it was below 2% to at least 2%. And most of the European countries ended up doing that. But of course, now the stakes are pretty high. The question is this really just an opening gambit? Is it a negotiation, a transaction, as Trump is very fond of doing? Or is it going to amount to some sort of more significant fissure between the US and the EU? And I might add that Ukraine is certainly contributing to that. It's part of the entire picture. My guess is that there probably will not be a full 25% imposition. It will be somewhat less, and it'll end up being a negotiation. And the Europeans may not like having their arm twisted, but at the end of the day, it needs to be corrected, this trade imbalance. And if this is the only way to do it, well, then so be it. What bothers me is that Trump has absolutely no hesitation in engaging in coercion or even extortion, as I view it in the case of Ukraine with this minerals deal, in order to get what he wants. That is really not a good way to treat friends and allies. And if he's doing that with friends and allies, is there anything that he won't do with enemies? That's what I find myself wondering.
Absolutely. Dr. Bhattacharya, looking at tariffs that might be imposed on border nations of Canada and Mexico, it seems they may be delayed past March the 4th and potentially moving into April. But Trump's team says the tariffs are still moving ahead. He's previously used tariffs with those border nations as a way of sort of getting what he wants, as almost as a threat. He spoke about, of course, the flow of fentanyl. He's spoken about immigration and asked both countries to ramp up their border efforts, which happened. Do you think this is going to be a bit of a cat and mouse situation where Trump's going to sort of threaten with tariffs, and then we'll see that the governments of those countries will then come into action, and then it will constantly be pushing it down the line? Or do you think Trump is finally going to pull the trigger and see those 25% tariffs on those border nations?
So in my view, Trump is ready to pull the trigger if required. Now, the if required part is the important part, and why will he be doing it and why is he going down this path is, in fact, as my co-panelist, Mr. Wagner, mentioned, the Trump administration is in a big hurry. He gave out the threat of 25% tariff to his two neighbors in the north and the south. They did not respond to the extent he needed them to respond. He's running out of time. He needs to show the outcome and the impact of the actions that he and his administration is taking. And clearly he can't wait for months for a long drawn negotiation. So if one of these partners, say Mexico or Canada, does not take commensurate action, which measures up to Trump's expectation, I think at some point in time he's going to pull the trigger as also a signal to the rest of the world that he means business. In the long run, if he ends up having 25% of tariff on everything coming from Canada and Mexico for a long period of time, obviously it's going to impact US quite badly. So it will lead to job loss in US, it will lead to uncompetitive products being manufactured in US, and so on and so forth. So he will have to then figure out a way to extricate himself from that situation, because at the end of the day, he understands and his team understands what is the implication of this tariff. All that they're trying to do is reset the tariff regime so that the US gets what they believe is a fair tariff regime from their perspective. And that's all that they're trying to look for. So in my opinion, it's a lot of posturing, but backed by the fact that they would be willing to pull the trigger if so required.
Yes, Ross Feingold, coming back to you. Canadian officials have expressed their concerns for the long-term impacts of these tariffs if they are imposed. Is there also a risk to the relationship between the two nations? Do you think Trump's sort of using of tariffs as potentially a tool in negotiations could sour relations moving past his term and looking forward towards the future of relations between Canada and the United States?
To analyze at this point, especially because the Canadian leadership is in the process of changing. The Liberal Party is going to have a new leader with Trudeau stepping away. And then shortly after, there's going to be an election, and the Conservatives might very well win that election. And one would have to make the assumption, recent tensions notwithstanding, that a right-of-center Canadian Prime Minister, who would still be a staunch advocate for Canada's interests, don't get me wrong, they're not going to betray Canada, but one would have to think that a right-of-center Canadian Prime Minister is going to get along better with a conservative US president like President Trump. So there's still actually some hope that in the medium term, relations could improve. But certainly relations are a bit frayed now. Trump and Trudeau never got along. There was the recent ice hockey tournament where we saw bad blood between US fans and Canadian fans on display. We also saw bad blood between the US team and the Canadian team on the ice displayed as well. But I think given the upcoming and highly likely change in government in Canada, there's potential for relations to improve in the medium term.
Yes, and Daniel Wagner, looking now down south of America to Mexico. Again, it's a similar situation. Urgent conversations are happening between delegates and officials from either country. The situation, though, is of course slightly different. How do you think relations between the US and Mexico will look moving forward, given the situation that we've seen, of course, with the Gulf of Mexico being renamed as the Gulf of America? There are tensions there, though sometimes it has been light-hearted. How do you see that relationship moving forward during Trump's regime and then onwards?
I think Mexico is really emblematic of what can happen when nations that are previously friends and are also neighbors become cantankerous. Claudia Sheinbaum, the president in Mexico, started from the beginning when these threats emerged and then when the tariffs were imposed originally to really push back and to get very nationalistic and to basically say, this will not stand. I think the thing that Trump doesn't understand is that there's always a cost to America and Americans for doing this sort of thing. He doesn't seem to understand that. And it seems to me that it may take the longer term imposition of significant tariffs on Mexico and counter tariffs on the US in order for that point to be driven home. Will there be long-term damage to the two nations? I think the long-term damage is probably only likely to last as long as Trump is in power. I think most nations, Mexico included, understand and realize that this is a phenomenon of Trump. It is not a phenomenon of America. And even though half of Americans support Trump and what he's doing, once the dust has settled and the people who have been negatively impacted by any of Trump's policies, realize what has been done, my guess is they're really going to change their mind in the voting booth, and we'll see that in less than 2 years in the midterms.
Absolutely. Dr. Bhattacharya, I do want to bring it back to aid because we are looking, of course, now at the US is standing across the world. With US aid being cut, there is a door opening for another nation to provide that support. That could put the American nation on the back foot.
Unfortunately, aid itself has now become a bad word. So when you're saying US is stepping back and somebody else is stepping in, it's with a sense of danger that the world is looking at that change, because really who's stepping in? It's China which is stepping in, and China has not really gained a lot of trust based on the set of actions they have taken in the last so many years. So the fact that USAID itself, with all the revelations that are coming out, seems to have had their fingers dirty in things that they should not have been involved in. And on top of it, when they are withdrawing, if we have China stepping in, that clearly sends alarm bells ringing across the world, because there is very little that nations can trust China with. What they've done in Sri Lanka with the Hambantota port, what they've done across, in Pakistan with the Gwadar port, and so on and so forth. There's a string of assets that they've acquired through either aid being provided or through loans being provided, which were predatory in nature. It's a very dangerous change that's happening. My view is that possibly as we move forward, nations will become a little more careful as to who are operating within their borders in the guise of aid. But we've also seen that in spite of the challenges and the alarm bells with just the loans part of China, there still has been multiple nations who are taking the loans signed off by their executive, be it the prime minister or the president or whoever is in charge. And so it begs to question as to why they're taking such decisions, what's in it for them, why they're taking a decision which seems to be detrimental to their nation's interest. These are questions to be asked, and that comes back to your question of what happens when US steps back from the aid. Will it be a more dangerous, with the beginning of a more dangerous era? And I think only time will tell which way we are going.
Daniel, bringing it back to this cabinet meeting, there was a warning, of course, to federal workers, but also a memo saying that more cuts were coming. Is this really an attack on the workforces and the federal workforces that have been sitting in the same state for a while, and Trump's looking really to cut the fat, which is a phrase that's been used on this programme? Or do you think this is a real shake-up and Trump's way of saying that the way things have been run in this country for too long aren't how I want them to be?
Well, it's probably all of the above. My sense is that part of what Trump is trying to do is basically to put federal employees on notice that even if you're not cut now, you could be cut later. And the element of fear that's running through the federal workforce is clearly unprecedented. This has not been very well thought through, obviously. And Trump and Musk, of course, are using a sledgehammer where they should be using a scalpel. And we've seen numerous instances already of where employees have been cut and then rehired because the administration realized too late that they made mistakes on basically firing critical or essential employees. A lot of Republicans who voted for Trump have now lost or will soon lose their jobs. This is something that Mr. Trump maybe didn't think too much about. The backlash is already happening. We're just a month into this administration. And I shudder when I think about what America is going to look like 4 years from now.
Ross Feingold, to finish off our discussion, I now want to look at America on the global stage. Meetings today with Russian officials. Vladimir Putin has talked about a new age for world order. Is this something that you think Donald Trump is a fan of? And where do you think he will leave the US in terms of standing geopolitically at the end of his 4-year term?
At a minimum, President Trump is simply not a fan of nation building, and that factors into why he's taken this view on USAID's activities around the world. A lot of those activities are about things like democracy building, enhancing rule of law. And President Trump simply doesn't see that as an obligation of the United States. He sees the United States as a trading nation. Of course, he doesn't want to see unfair trade or what's unfair for the United States when trading with trade partners all over the world. But clearly, some of the things that we often refer to as soft power, President Trump does not see the value in doing that, and that's why he's eliminating that. So going forward, the United States will have more of a trade relationship with its key trading partners and might have less of a relationship with developing countries in places like Africa or some parts of the Middle East. That remains to be seen, but it's very possible. And that the focus is going to be on the countries where the United States has trade or significant trade, as long as President Trump believes that he's addressed some of the trade imbalance, market access types of issues.
Ross, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much also to Daniel and Dr. Bhattacharya. This is, of course, the first cabinet meeting. There are many to come, and we will be there to bring you all of the latest as they happen. Thank you.